Stephen Downs. Welcome back to Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. We're in Module 5 looking at approaches to ethics, and as you can see on the screen, in this talk we'll be talking about, and to some degree it carries personal meaning for me because I've always lived in a world basically governed by social contracts, or what people have called social contracts, and I've often pushed back against them. I'm called to think of a case recently where I had an interaction on Twitter. Doesn't everything start that way? Where corporations stopped commenting on my tweets, and my response was, "Who died and made you king?" And so the exchange went back and forth. They disapproved of my language. I disapproved of their disapproval and said, basically, I am not governed by what you think are the social conventions. But they said, there is an agreement that what happens on Twitter, at least in small discussion groups, are private. And, it raises the question of what these agreements consist in, what their applicability is, and what the long-term impact of them is. And I'll come back to that discussion maybe a bit later in the talk, but this sort of interaction has an effect on me, and I think it has an effect on a lot of people. And so, although we think of social contracts as within the domain of political science or political philosophy, it really strikes home to most people. So that's what I want to talk about today. We're going to go through a wide range of theories. Too much content. This could be a whole theory. This could be a whole degree program. So I'm going to miss some things, but that can't be avoided. But I hope this gives you a sense of some of the debates and some of the discussions in the field. So what are social contracts? Well, the core idea of a social contract is the idea that ethics, whatever we think it is, somehow results from an agreement within a community. And every word of that core idea could be questioned. The major components, at least to my mind, of social contract ethics are, first of all, the process or method by which agreement is reached. Secondly, the determination of what the actual contents are of the resulting agreement. And then third, what the motivation is to abide by the agreement. And we can see that all three of these things are necessary. There needs to be some means of reaching an agreement, whatever it is. And we'll look at two major types. There needs to be some understanding of the contents of the agreement, but it wouldn't also be ethical unless individuals feel compelled to follow the principles. So we need all three. On the diagram there, this is a diagram of the political dimensions of social contracts. But these spill over into ethical dimensions as well. And so we have dimensions of personal liberty and economic liberty contrasted with economic security and personal or group security. We can draw, the scale between left and right, anarchist and totalitarian, and we could probably draw it along any number of other axes. And I sort of want to caution, before we get too deep into this, that we need to keep the ethical domain and the political domain separate. At least I think we do. I mean, not everybody would agree with that. Some people would say, the ethic that governs our society should also be the law that governs our society. But I think that there are good reasons for keeping this discussion separate. And we'll return to some of those as well as we go through this talk. So I'm going to begin with the concept of mores. Now, mores aren't strictly speaking ethical principles, but they give us a sense of where social contractarian ethical principles arise. And they're important to understand both in terms of their genesis and their content. Mores are not deliberately invented or thought of or worked out by some people in society. They're not created or constructed, we might say. Rather, they emerge gradually out of the customary practices of the people, largely without conscious choice or intention. And so in this way, they're similar to folkways, and they're similar to social norms, but they carry a bit more of an edge to them in the sense that if you violate a moray, you will probably be subject to some sort of social sanction. Social mores will cover conventional practices regarding relationships and sex, maybe things like treatment of animals, probably things like honesty, keeping your word, perhaps nonviolence, or at least the appropriate use of violence. They tend to be fuzzy and unclear. Their enforcement is not always even-handed, and it's all a very loose system. But it's also a system that most of us understand. I would not walk out naked in the community, not because it's against the law. Actually, I'm not sure if it is. But because I'd be violating a moray. I'd be violating a community standard of decency if I did that. And that's how mores work. But over time, we see a need for more of a formalization of these and more of a reasoning, to come up with a reasoning behind their development and their implementation. And that's what leads us into social contract theory. We can think of it as arising from situations where things like mores don't really seem to help us. A classic example is called the prisoner's dilemma. And the way this works is each prisoner is given the opportunity to betray the others. So there are two prisoners, A and B. You can betray the other person or you can stay silent. If you betray the other person, you get off scot-free. But the other person suffers. If you both betray each other, you both suffer. But if you both stay silent, you both benefit. Now, the benefit isn't as much as you could get if you betray the other and the other does not betray you. So there's an incentive there to hope that the other person is altruistic and you're not, so that you can get off scot-free and let them pay the whole price. But you can see how that breaks down, because if you look at the overall benefit, if you're both silent, you both pay a little bit, but not very much. And certainly nothing compared to the result for either one of you or both of you if you betray the other. We see the diagram of the calculation here, right? So here we have the, indicating with the mouse, here we have the stay silent calculation, here we have the betrays calculation, and here we have one or the other. So the idea of the prisoner's dilemma is that the rational behavior here is governed not only by what happens to you, but also what happens to your friend. And in that calculation, the rational behavior here is to stay silent. But typical ethics, traditional ethics, doesn't seem to work that way. Certainly, something like this would be dramatically underdetermined by a system of social mores. Although I might add, there are unwritten social codes that say, that you do not betray the other. So, in a sense, a lot of social mores and social customs have addressed this prisoner dilemma. But how do they do it? What is the thinking behind it? Well, what we find is that overall, in the wider scheme of things, though, we haven't solved it. Look at pollution, right? Suppose you live in a society that has highly polluting cars, right? You can put a catalytic converter on your car. It's going to cost you money, but although you'll reduce pollution a little bit, it really won't change the overall scheme of things. For it to work, everybody has to do it, which means everybody has to pay a cost. But if nobody wants to pay the cost, nobody will do it, and we end up with really bad pollution. So we need some mechanism of reaching some kind of agreement. We're seeing the similar sort of dilemma playing out on the global stage. We just had some recent climate talks, which once again ended up in futility. And the argument is often advanced, well, why should we do anything to address climate change? Because, probably China and India aren't going to do anything. And so, we're paying a cost, but we're not getting any result. And the idea of the solution to the prisoner's dilemma is you have to take that leap of faith. But it's really hard to reach that leap of faith, without some sort of formal structure, which is why they have these talks. Similarly, with the current pandemic, everybody benefits if each of us wears a mask. Wearing a mask is a bit of an inconvenience for each of us, and it really only works if everybody wears a mask. But not everybody wears a mask. So again, we have the same sort of dilemma. So what we need, it is argued, is some kind of system of morality by agreement. And typically this expresses itself as an explicit agreement. Social mores will take you a certain distance, but at some point we've got to come to an agreement. Specifically, to quote James Rachels from his well-known book, The Elements of Moral Philosophy, morality consists in the set of rules governing how people are to treat each other that rational people will agree to accept for their mutual benefit on the condition that others follow those rules as well. And so you see the different elements here of the solution to the prisoner's dilemma. We're going to agree with rules. It's for our mutual benefit, and the condition is everybody has to follow the rules. You see this come up all the time in society. Unionism, a unionized workplace is basically this kind of thing. We will benefit if we bargain collectively in the workplace, but the thing is, everybody has to agree to be bound by the bargaining one way or another. You can't have some people bargaining and others, as they say, acting as free riders. Okay, so what's the justification for all of that? Well, we go back to Thomas Hobbes, who didn't actually write in 1986. He wrote, I think it's the 15 or 1600s. And that's a time in Britain where there was significant debate about the role of the monarchy and the role of the barons, about who should basically control the state. And the argument advanced by Thomas Hobbes is that we, and by we he means people who have their own armies, should willingly cede power to the monarch in order to escape the state of nature in which no rules exist, and where, as he says, there are, quote, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You see the appeal here, right? The consequences to ourselves not ceding power to a monarch are significant. You know, if we're all warring among ourselves, if we all take justice into our own hands, then we're in a state of perpetual conflict. And he argues this is the natural state, right? This is how things would be if we did not reach this agreement. So we agree to cede the right of executing punishments, enforcing the law, to the monarch. We don't take it into our own hands, and that's what keeps everybody safe. So the appeal here is safety and security. Another approach to creating a social contract was advanced by John Locke, writing around the same time, a little after Thomas Hobbes. And again, Locke depicts the contract as a mechanism of people working together, but instead of protecting us from each other, as Hobbes describes it, in the case of Locke, it's a mechanism to defend the rights of citizens against the sovereign, the king. And in particular, to protect their right to property. Locke's philosophy, political philosophy, is based to a large degree in property. And his view of property is that anything that we find in nature and that we add our own labor to, by that very fact, becomes our property, and we have a right over it. We get to keep it, to sell it, to do what we want with it. And this fundamental right needs to be defended against monarchs who, despite not actually having done any labor themselves, would attempt to seize our property. And you can see this reflected in a lot of political discussion today, where people say, you know, my property, my land is mine, government stay away, government stay out of it. That's the Lockean sort of view. And the way this is enforced is by the creation of the social contract, whereby people work together in order to protect this right to property. And Locke says, basically, if the sovereign violates that, if the state becomes too repressive, then there are two means of remedy. The one means is to move away. And in John Locke's time, a lot of people did exactly that. And so we have the migration, for example, of the Quakers to North America, or even the exile of criminals to Australia. And the other way is to take up arms and overthrow the monarch. And here we have the idea that the right to, well, take up arms and overthrow the monarch is based on this social contract. We are giving ourselves an agreement that if it comes to that, that's what we'll do. Again, you know, there's this presumption here, not so much of the inherent badness of humans, but the inherent badness of monarchs or power structures or the state generally. And it's the state that we most want to protect ourselves from. And it's interesting to see how much of that is reflected in some societies today, sometimes legitimately. I mean, sometimes there are certainly legitimate reasons to fear the state. Other times, maybe not so much so. So, in the 1700s, and we reach the Enlightenment and a more rationally conceived structure of morality and civilization, we get JeanJacques Rousseau, writing a number of years before the French Revolution, but no doubt influential on it. And he writes, and I've said this before, man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. And here, the oppressor is not each other, and it's not the monarch specifically, but it's society as a whole. And the net effect of society is to constrain the natural freedom of people and instead to enslave them, to serve the will of the master, whoever that is. And that wasn't, an exaggeration in Rousseau's time. People didn't have individual freedom. And in places like, for example, Russia, the idea of freeing the serfs was a real question. And what Rousseau also thought was that the contract, although it's a social contract, the objective isn't simply to protect us from harm from each other or to protect our property, but rather to ascertain what could be called the general will, which would be expressed by the unanimity of citizens. That's a hard concept to put a finger on, although, this concept of a social will or a general will is going to echo through philosophy since the days of Rousseau. And you see it in Hegel in the phenomenology of right, with a world spirit moving through history, or even Marx's dialectical materialism, and again, thinking of the will of humanity moving through history, and that's where we get the expression, being on the right side of history, and so on. And Rousseau is very careful to caution against putting important functions, like, say, education, into the hands of individuals or into the hands of interest groups, because he says inevitably they will turn this power around to work to their own advantage rather than to the advantage of the will of the entire people. So this is a representation of Rousseau's theory, but it contains elements of all theories. And for those of you listening on audio, what I've got up here is a diagram that I grabbed from Pinterest. But in the center we have state and sovereign linked together by laws, and the laws are executed by government, which may be a democracy, maybe an aristocracy, maybe a monarchy, but the idea here is it's the executive branch, if you will. And these laws are basically declarations of a general will, and that general will results from a social contract that people agree to support and obey. So we've got government, state, which is the subject's laws, sovereign, which might be citizens, a will, and then individuals, and then these individuals express their general will through a combination of civil freedom and natural freedom. And we'll come back to the subject of freedom, but without freedom, it's not possible for individuals to express and see implemented their will in the general will. So these tend to be the major components of a social contract model of ethics. And, the players can change, but you're going to get the same sort of idea no matter what. You're going to have the will, or the overall values. You're going to have the laws or the principles. You're going to have an enforcement mechanism. You're going to have a deliberation mechanism, and then the social conditions that make all of this possible. It's pretty sophisticated and elegant theory of ethics. I mean, there's a lot to recommend it. But there are problems. Oh, yes, there are problems. One of the most significant problems is enforcement. And I would even say that, enforcement sometimes feeds back in on itself. So, if we're looking at political philosophy, we jump right into the question of police powers. We jump into forms of sanction or punishment. And social contract theory, it may be criticized, gives government too much powers, and I'm quoting here, to make laws under the guise of protecting the public. Specifically, governments may use the cloak of the social contract to invoke the fear of a state of nature to warrant laws that are intrusive. And that's from an Open Text BC text on social contract theory. And we've seen this play out, haven't we? And we've seen more than one politician raise the scepter of anarchy if we don't give the police or the army or whatever enough power to protect us. But the problem is, who protects us from the police? And even more to the point, the idea of what the protectors want feeds back into what should become law, feeds back into our idea of what is morally right. Whatever is good for the police, whatever is good for the military, that's good for society. Supporting these things, therefore, becomes ethically good, or at least a social good on which other ethics may be based. But it can go to extremes. I go back to that original Twitter debate that I had, which was just a Twitter debate, so it doesn't mean anything. But the idea that was being expressed here by the other person was that, A, there is this expectation of privacy, and B, this expectation needed to be addressed in tweets addressed to companies in order for it to be enforced, but also in order for it to be created in the first place. Like, there wouldn't be this violation of ethics unless people enforced it. So it feeds back into itself. But, it comes back down to my first question: who died and made them king?